At Oro 2:50 in the morning, a drone threat alert goes out across the Republic of Tatarstan, and almost nobody who hears it believes it applies to them. Nizhnekamsk has spent 4 years watching this war on television. A 250,000-person refining town 1,000 kilometers past every frontline map anyone here has ever drawn. Airport staff run the Covier protocol, the standard procedure for grounding operations when an unidentified object enters the sky. The kind of drill that has always felt theoretical here. By dawn on August 10, 2026, the drill stops being theoretical. The sky over Nizhnekamsk and the neighboring city of Chistopol fills with engine noise that doesn't belong to Russia, and one of the country's largest oil refineries is on fire. This is the story of how a machine built from plywood, carbon fiber, and a 2-cylinder engine flew farther than most commercial airliners' crews, found a target the size of a parking lot in a city its operators have never seen with their own eyes, and did it without a single Russian interceptor getting close enough to matter. The machine is the FP-1, built by a Ukrainian company called Firepoint that did not exist as a defense manufacturer when the invasion began. Its founders were a film location scout, an IT entrepreneur, and a man who used to run a concrete business. None of them had built a weapon before 2022. They started with about a dozen people in November of that year, working from what was essentially a garage-scale operation, and within 3 years they had turned that into one of the most consequential weapons programs of the entire war. What they built is a one-way attack drone with a documented range up to 1,600 kilometers, a twin-boom fuselage of plywood and carbon fiber composite, an inverted V-tail, and a pusher propeller turned by a 2-cylinder engine. Firepoint makes the warhead and most of the engine in-house rather than relying on off-the-shelf parts the way many drone manufacturers do. And the payload is modular, scaling between roughly 60 and 120 kilograms of fragmentation or shape charge explosive, depending on how far the mission needs it to fly. It costs approximately $55,000 to produce, a fraction of what a single Russian Shahed-type drone costs to send the other direction into Ukraine by the hundreds most nights. And Firepoint now builds close to 200 of them a day across more than 50 deliberately scattered production sites, a distributed manufacturing model built specifically so that a single Russian missile strike can never shut the whole line down. Guidance comes from inertial navigation backed by satellite positioning and electronic counter-countermeasures, holding a course even through the kind of jamming and spoofing belts Russia has built along its own border. In the terminal phase, some variants take control through Starlink Mini satellite links, letting a remote pilot steer the last few kilometers with something close to first-person precision, correcting for a moving vehicle, a repositioned defense, or simply picking the exact point on a building where the warhead will do the most damage. Nizhnekamsk sits roughly 1,200 kilometers from Ukrainian-held territory. This was not the drone's maximum range. It was a fraction of it. Newer FP-1 variants, with fuel tanks folded into a redesigned wing structure, have already been credited with strikes on refineries more than 3,000 kilometers from the border, in Tyumen and Omsk, deep in Russia's interior. Whatever flew into Tatarstan that morning had range to spare. The target waiting at the end of that flight was not one building, it was an entire industrial district. Nizhnekamsk hosts TANECO, part of the Tatneft group and one of Russia's newest, most technologically advanced refineries, processing more than 16 million tons of crude a year, with a specialization in deep refining that yields higher value products including aviation fuel. Beside it sits Nizhnekamsk Neftekhim, a massive petrochemical complex, and a short drive away sits TAFE NK, a second refinery with its own capacity of over 7 million tons of crude and up to 1 million tons of gas condensate annually. Together they make this single city one of the densest concentrations of refining and petrochemical capacity anywhere in Russia. Nizhnekamsk Neftekhim's products don't just fuel cars. Its plastics, synthetic rubber, and solvents feed directly into Russia's defense industrial base, supplying plants like Kamensky Combine and the Perm Powder Plant, facilities that manufacture solid rocket propellant, engines, and warhead charges for the same class of cruise missiles Russia fires back into Ukrainian cities. Strike the refining side and you dent Moscow's fuel supply. Strike the petrochemical side and you're pulling at a thread that runs straight into the munitions factories keeping the war itself running. Geolocation analysis of the strike footage placed the impact inside the petrochemical complex, in the area of a storage facility and a combined heat and power plant. The kind of target that keeps an entire industrial zone electrified and running. Ukraine's general staff has hit TANECO before. In June of 2026, an attack Reuters reported halted the refinery's operation operations entirely, and Yelabuga, a Tatarstan city not far from Nizhnekamsk that assembles Iranian-designed Shahed drones under license, has been struck as well. Whatever Russia rebuilt since those earlier strikes was rebuilt in the open, with no illusions left about whether Tatarstan was safe. What makes a target this deep survivable for months and then suddenly not is the same thing that makes air defense across a country spanning 11 time zones so brutally uneven. Russia's densest, most layered air defense sits around Moscow, around military airfields, around the Kremlin itself, a belt so thick that after Ukrainian drones tore through it to hit the Moscow oil refinery, just 15 kilometers from the Kremlin, Russia had to redeploy additional Panzer systems. Some reportedly pulled straight off the front line, just to plug the gap. Analysts who tracked those redeployments noted something telling. Several of the Panzer units arriving in Moscow suburbs still carried the protective anti-drone netting normally fitted only to systems operating near active combat, and at least one arrived with an incomplete ammunition load, evidence that the systems were rushed in under pressure rather than cycled through in an orderly rotation. That is what it costs to defend one refinery near the capital. Tatarstan sits roughly 1,400 kilometers from that belt, and no comparable density of interceptors has ever been built around it, because for most of the war nobody believed it needed to be. A radar built to track a low, slow airframe only holds a solid return out to the point where the curve of the Earth stops hiding it, and against a target flying at a few hundred meters, that horizon can be barely 20 or 30 kilometers away, a window of minutes rather than the hour or more a defender would want. Russia's defense ministry claimed 456 drones intercepted that same night across 16 regions, a number that sounds decisive until you notice what it doesn't say. How many of those interceptions happened inside Moscow's dense, redundant belt, and how many of the drones that got through were aimed at towns like Nizhnekamsk, which had almost nothing standing between them and the sky at all? Open-source trackers monitoring the broader campaign have separately noted that Russian anti-drone netting installed at fuel depots and refineries has been failing at a consistent rate from Krasnodar all the way to Tatarstan, a pattern that points to a doctrine still built around point interceptors rather than the kind of layered passive defenses that might actually blunt a strike like this one. By the time residents in Nizhnekamsk and the neighboring city of Chistopol were filming engine noise overhead and columns of smoke climbing into the morning light, the toll was already becoming the deadliest single strike Russia had absorbed in years of this war. Regional authorities confirmed at least 13 deaths, including a child, and the wounded count climbed steadily through the day, first past 39, then to 75, then finally settling above 78 as hospitals across the region reported in. 9 of those 13 deaths came from a single hit, and it did not land on a processing unit or a storage tank. It landed on a hostel, an ordinary residential building housing migrant laborers from Central Asia, the kind of low-wage workforce that keeps refinery towns like this one staffed around the clock. Uzbekistan's consulate in Tatarstan confirmed 7 of its own citizens among the dead, and citizens of Kyrgyzstan were reported among the casualties as well. Between 2 and 3 million Uzbek citizens work inside Russia at any given time, their remittances propping up a meaningful share of Uzbekistan's own economy. And on this particular morning, in this particular city, that labor migration collided directly with a war those workers had no part in. This is the unglamorous arithmetic that a strike package this large always carries with it. Warheads built to gut refinery infrastructure and petrochemical storage don't discriminate between a processing unit and a dormitory a few hundred meters away, and in a city that had never drawn air raid shelters into its planning because nobody believed the war would reach that far east. The workers who kept these plants running paid for that assumption in the most direct way there is. Tatarstan's regional head, Rustam Minikhanov, called it another brutal attack in a statement to residents, and the mayor of Nizhnekamsk, Radmir Belyayev, announced a formal day of mourning on Telegram before the smoke over the refinery had even cleared. Russian state media, true to a pattern that is held for most of the war, offered no confirmation of what exactly burned inside the industrial zone, describing only a massive drone attack targeting industrial and civilian facilities. Ukraine's general staff was unusually direct by its own standards, stating plainly that its forces had struck the TANECO refinery and that the facility caught fire. And Andriy Kovalenko, head of Ukraine's Center for Countering Disinformation, went further, framing the strike in explicit strategic terms. The facilities Ukraine targets are the ones used to carry out attacks against Ukraine and manufacture weapons for Russia's war effort, and that, in his telling is precisely why they remain fair game regardless of how far inland they sit. That directness matters, because for most of this war, Kiev has stayed quiet about strikes deep inside Russian territory, letting satellite imagery and telegram footage do the talking instead. Naming this one openly, less than a day after it happened, was its own kind of signal, an acknowledgement that the deterrent value of admitting responsibility now outweighs whatever ambiguity used to be worth preserving. And this was not an isolated event. It was one entry in a campaign that has been accelerating for over a year and shows no sign of leveling off. Independent analysis has tracked Ukraine conducting roughly 685 deep strikes in 2025 alone, on pace to exceed 800 in 2026, with successful penetrations deep into Russian-held and Russian home territory rising by well over 1,000% since the start of the year, according to Ukraine's own unmanned systems forces. Just days before Nizhnekamsk burned, Ukrainian drones had already reached the Ilsky refinery in Krasnodar Krai for the 17th time of the war, struck an oil refinery in Saratov, and hit facilities near Moscow's own Kapotnya refinery on the same night Tatarstan was targeted. Days after, President Zelensky confirmed further strikes on the Gazprom-operated Neftekhim Salavat complex in Bashkortostan, roughly 1,300 kilometers from the border, and the Slavneft Yanos refinery in Yaroslavl. By midsummer, Ukrainian long-range drones had already flown as far as Tyumen and Omsk, more than 2,000 and then 3,400 kilometers from the border respectively, striking Omsk's cracking catalyst production, a facility other Russian refineries quietly depend on to keep their own secondary processing running. British and Russian open-source monitors have logged Ukrainian drones reaching 21 of Russia's 38 major refineries since the start of 2025, with 14 hit in a single month during last year's peak. The consequences show up far from any front line. Gas station lines have become a recurring feature across multiple Russian regions. Some stations have simply stopped selling fuel because antitrust rules prevent them from raising prices to match supply. And in occupied Crimea, the local administration has imposed a 20-liter purchase limit per customer alongside hard price caps. This is not a campaign chasing headlines. It is a campaign chasing Russia's ability to keep its own war machine supplied, refinery by refinery, until the map of untouched targets runs out. What Nizhnekamsk demonstrates, more starkly than almost any strike before it, is how little of Russia's vast interior can actually be defended once an adversary builds a drone cheap enough to produce by the hundred and long-ranged enough to treat the entire country as reachable. You cannot build a Moscow-grade air defense belt around every industrial city in 11 time zones. You can only choose which ones to protect, and by choosing, you tell your enemy exactly where the gaps are. Tatarstan learned that lesson at 2:50 in the morning, in the space of a single alert most residents didn't believe applied to them. If you enjoyed this video, watch the one where Ukrainian drones burned the Black Sea Fleet's last safe harbor.